There, there is some truth to what you said. Good market, bad market. Even in bad markets, eventually people just acquiesce and like, yeah, you know what? It doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. And so they, you know, one of the things I like about our occupation is buying and selling homes is just a function of life. People don't stop living. They may pause, they may be waiting a little bit, but eventually it's got to keep going, right? People have to move for jobs. People are retiring. People get married. People their houses their households increase. They have kids. So these are all natural forcing functions that push our industry along. It's one of the things, frankly, I really like about it. How many of you were in the market? Grandma Joyce, I love your tag there. How many of us were in the Great Recession that started in 2000, tail end of 2007 and pretty much lasted through the entire 2012? Come on, raise your hands. And if you're not turning on your video, which I hate, just use your emoji and raise your hand. Jessica, thank you. Look at that. I shamed you into turning on your camera. I love it. Clint, thank you. Well, the point being is even in 2008, and honestly, for those of you that are newer in the industry, I'll just paint a quick picture. Um, Completely unlike this market, and I need to stress that point. We had overbuilt to the tune of about 30 to 40% nationwide, and it was true here in Utah as well, the amount of homes that were being digested by the market. So there was truly a glut of properties. And then you combined it with what they call mark to market accounting principles, where banks had to show that they had a certain percentage of assets actually not lended out on. And so they were trying to pull things back, which made money scarce, which just exacerbated the problem. And several other things came into play, and it just created a malaise that where nobody wanted to do anything. But even in that market, Joyce, you can back me up on this. Even in that market, after everybody figured out, I was like, well, this is the lay of the land for the foreseeable future. We still bought and sold real estate. Now, a lot of those were short sales and foreclosures, but it's still real estate, my friends, right? Did you enjoy that time, Joyce? You're muted. And now she's frozen. See what happens. Yes, there we go. We got your video, but we don't have your audio. Okay. Well, not having any success, Joyce, when you get that figured out, feel free to chime in. But for sake of time, I just hope we all understand this, right? We're resilient. What's the word that gets written in a lot of books now? We have grit. We know how to push through and learn things. And this is nowhere, it's not even remotely close to what we were going through in '08. So I hope you're encouraged by that. Um, you know, I've talked to those that are in leadership at different associations, and they've had some pullback on the number of agents that have renewed over the past 6 months. And so your competition's getting less. And here's one thing I wanted to start with today. So give me 2 seconds here. I'm going to pull this up, because I think this is something, January is the time for us to make New Year's resolutions, right? And this is one resolution I want you guys to make. So now if I can, all right, share my screen. Here it comes. All right, so all of you can see my login to the MLS here, right? And I've said this before, but I'm going to take it a step further. I want you today, maybe even while we're on this call, go to your Google Calendar and give yourself a recurring calendar appointment. I would suggest Monday morning's a really good time because we're excited about the week and we're We're charged up from the weekend, but this is super simple. Give yourself a calendar appointment that recurs every Monday and say, go check Rapid Stats. Okay. And here's all I want you to do. You log into the MLS. Now I get it. Some of you down in St. George, you have a little different mechanism, but the Lions and a lot of you down there have logins to utahrealestate.com. So I'm going to go with this. If you go to Rapid Stats, take you to their interface. This is your dashboard. We've covered this before. Anybody can do this far, right? And the next thing I want you to do is to just do a couple of quick things. You see these three across the top? Active, sold, under contract, and it's showing where they are today or within the last 30 days. And that's cool, right? We can say, look, there's 9,480 active listings on the MLS. That's a good chunk. But where it starts to move the needle is when you say, okay, go compare that to 365 days ago. Look at that. That was super hard, right? One click, and all of a sudden you have perspective. You have perspective of, hey, we're at 9,000 and change versus 7,700. So we're up 22% on listings from a year ago. That should get you charged up, especially if you're representing buyers. Let's move over to the next one. And this is the solds. Okay, in the last 30 days, we sold 2,359. How does that compare with a year ago?
Yeah. And
we're up 6%. Okay. And then the last one is under contracts. And when you deal with statistics, and you guys don't have to be stat geeks, but there are things that we call predictive or leading indicators.
Hey, Siri.
Oh, Jen, I'm going to mute you. There we go. Since I'm not Siri, but if we do the same thing with under contracts, the leading indicator kind of shows where the market's heading compared to a year ago. We're up 12%. Okay, now listen, all of you, look at the screen here. Look at my face and me pleading with hand gestures. That includes you, D. How hard was that? Literally, I had to explain it the first time, but you could come in on a Monday because you're going to have a calendar appointment for yourself to sharpen the saw a little bit and just come in every Monday and be like, where is the market? Listings are up 22%. Sorry, listing count is up 22%. Solds are up 6%. And under contracts, which is indicating where the market's going, are up 12%. Okay. Now, that doesn't get you all the way there, but if you just got in the habit of doing that, you would be able, anytime somebody asked the question, hey, what's going on in the market? Parker, is it a good time to buy or sell? Right? You would have stats at the ready that say, actually, you know what? Listing counts up 22%. Or, oh, by the way, if you want to be a buyer, just know that the properties are going under contract at a faster rate. They're up 12% versus a year ago. These are not hard things to say, guys, but if you don't do them, if you don't set a calendar appointment and just spend 5 minutes on Monday at a minimum and just get your head wrapped around where the market is, well, then when somebody asks the question, you don't look as smart as I know you are. So please, I'm asking you to commit to this as a regular occurrence. And as you do, you'll find other stats that are helpful, but even this bare minimum will greatly help you in your endeavors. Okay? Agreed? Give me a thumbs up or a smiley face emoji or whatever else. All right, thanks, Jeff. Okay, it is the front end of the year, and I am going to pull over onto this screen here. Can you guys, let's see this. I was going through, gosh, I want to see if I can make this. There we go. This will work. 2 seconds, guys. Stop share. Okay. If I do just a quick whiteboard here, new whiteboard. Can you all see this whiteboard that's coming up? Okay.
Yep.
As soon as it loads, don't show this again. I'm going to put up kind of the agenda, but let me just start by saying this. As I've been doing my planning for 2025 and the various responsibilities I have, obviously, Let's see if I can put this here now. Control V. Wow. That really didn't come across the way I wanted it, but you'll get the idea. We have 20 slots for the year for this contracts and negotiations. This was all indented and nice, and I apologize that it didn't indent the way I want. But I wanted to make sure that you understand if you commit to this call on a regular basis, 2 hours per month, right? I believe in boiling this down so you understand what I'm asking you to commit to. 2 hours a month. Here are the things that we will cover this year. There will probably be a few more, but this is kind of my rough outline. So let me just rapid fire through these. REPC key sections and their purpose and potential consequences. Disclosures, including AIG, seller's property condition disclosure, limited agency consent, unrepresented buyer, notice of interest disclosure. The proper mechanics of offers, counteroffers, addendas, cancellations, reinstatements. The many faces of earnest money, including earnest money being held at title, deadlines and repercussions, non-refundable and non-refundable release to seller, earnest money. Who's doodling all over my my whiteboard? All of you, knock it off. I can see your names. Okay, and the ramifications of non-refundable earnest money. Okay, Section 16 remedies as it pertains to earnest money, requirements for us to return earnest money, 83BI requirements in the REPC, disputing earnest money release and what is required. Okay, seller financing, getting more popular, pros, cons, pitfalls, key addenda and keys to writing addenda. So the general concepts when writing, including brevity and words to use and words to avoid being used, the blank addendum, the resolution of due diligence addendum, the closing cost addendum, assignment of REPC addendum, appraisal addendum, reinstatement addendum, time clause addendum, subject to sell addendum. Oops, how do I scroll this down? Subject to securing a house for the seller addendum. Then getting into objection handling and its psychology, successful negotiations, situations, techniques, and dialogues, the importance of understanding your personality type and other people's personality types. Of course, fan favorite, the quarterly DRE newsletter, also known as People Magazine for realtors. Successfully avoiding or navigating code of ethics complaints, DRE complaints, and civil litigation. So that gives us a smattering of what we will be covering this year. That's a pretty impressive list, right? I think if all of you could like boil that information down and just pour it into your head, you'd be so much better off than you currently are. And now connecting the final dots, it's simply this: 2 hours a month, second and fourth Mondays, 10 o'clock, and we will cover all of that and a little bit more. So I wanted to paint the bigger picture for you guys, what your commitment to being on this call entails and what you should expect to get out of it and how much better off you'll be because of it. Fair enough? All right, fantastic. Having said that, the downside, as I have been looking at this and planning out the year, is I realize, I always want to go on to always new things, and that doesn't fit the mold here. There's a phrase that is kind of cute, but it's really true. Repetition is the mother of learning. Let me say that again. See what I did there? Repetition is the mother of learning. And as we go through these and what I'm going to cover today, you're going to see, even though it sounds simple. So for instance, I'm going to be talking about the first half of the REPC today and some things that maybe you're not aware of or things that you need to be reminded of. You'll see how much content is in there. So yeah, repetition is in order. So having said that, let's get underway with that. I'm going to pull up on my screen, and I'll say one other thing too. I go through and I spend time marking these documents. I've told some of you this in the past from back when I was a practicing agent, I wanted to do a good job in front of my clients. I wanted not only to be contract savvy, but I wanted them to see that they were in good hands when working with me. And so what I would do is I would take those documents, Parker, you know this because we talked about it a lot back in the day. I would take the documents and I would literally get a highlighter and I would highlight and I'd write some things in the margins and reasons why this was important. And what I did is I had a folder that anytime I met with a buyer, I had my buyer folder and the key documents, and they were all marked up. And at one point I thought, well, this is stupid. I should just make copies of this and hand it out to the buyers or hand it out to sellers. And the reality is most of them, they kind of get a glazed over look because most people, they understand that there's significant things in the contract, but they don't necessarily want to read from front to back. And so there was a high degree of appreciation for highlighting the key points. And what it did was it reinforced to them that I was a good agent for them because I knew my craft. I was going to take good care of them. I'll finish with one comment on that and then we'll jump into it. For years, I tried to remind agents that when somebody asked what you did, you were to tell them with a smile on your face, you're glue. You hold everything together. And what that did was it was a setup for a conversation to establish your value, right? It's kind of a joke. People are like, glue, what do you mean? Now you have an inquiring mind and now you get to fill in the blanks. And it's like, well, listen, most people just kind of look at the transaction as, oh, you go find a property and you sell. And this is where you introduce all of your value propositions. There's so much language that has repercussions in the contracts. There's so many disclosures that need to take place. There's so many timeline consequences, right? We need to do inspections. You need to know how to protect your earnest money. You need to know, about home warranties and what they, and you can create this whole list and all of a sudden they're going, dang, I didn't know it was that involved. And I sure am glad that I have somebody that understands those pieces and has an intelligent approach to protect me as I go through that process. So if you haven't worked something out like that yourself in your dialogue and having something to present to them, to show them why you're good throughout this year, and all you have to do is send me an email saying, hey, I want your marked up document of what you covered today, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Okay. All right. Having said that, let's start really quickly here. The REPC. If you haven't been paying attention, you want to make sure if you've got a copy of the REPC that you've been using or it's stored somewhere on your desktop and you haven't updated in a while, you probably want to do that because it has changed. The newest version, if you go all the way to the bottom, this is how you know. Look at the date, right? So this one was most recently updated December 4th of 2024. So if you got an old one, you might be missing some paragraphs. So today's purpose is to get through the first half of the contract and the key areas. So I'm going to go quickly. I really like it when we are interactive on this call. So if you have an issue, unmute your mic and just say, hey, Matt, drill down on that. Okay. And I'll try and address anything that you bring up. Now, I'm going to start with this. I didn't specifically cover the earnest money because we're going to do a separate training, like I showed you, on earnest money. But this is important. Just a quick reminder. I ask this question all the time. How long does your client have and how long do we have to get the earnest money into our trust account when they have an accepted offer? Anybody chime in?
4 days.
4 days.
4 days what?
4 days after an accepted
From
contract.
acceptance.
So
4
it's
days after acceptance.
4
it
days
is-
after acceptance, and then you have, I believe the brokerage has 4 days to ensure that is it cashed or that it's being held in the trust account?
Ah, good question, Parker. So let's stick with the days first and I'll come back to the cashed. So what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, we have a total of 8 days. Trick question.
No.
I'm setting you up.
No.
What's the
I
answer,
think so.
Savannah?
We have 4 days from acceptance to get it to the brokerage. and then another 4 days from there. But if they get it within 2 days to the brokerage, that starts the clock for the 4 days for deposit.
Right, there's two timelines there. That's the point I'm trying to drive home. There's not one. You don't get to add the two together. I mean, like in their maximums, you have to say, first and foremost, did the buyer get it to us within the 4 days? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, then the question is, well, what day? If they got it to us on day one, then we have a total of 5 days to get it into the trust account. If they got it to us on day two, then we have 6. You guys get the idea. So the theoretical maximum is 8 days, business days, not calendar days. Okay, that's important. I don't drive these points home for trivia. I drive them home because we see agents still not quite get this right. Oh gosh, I didn't know. And so that's why I want to be explicit with that. Okay. And then to Parker's point, if you look at the verbiage, right, it says that the brokerage shall have 4 days, here we go, I'm highlighting it, in which to deposit the earnest money. Deposit. It doesn't mean cleared funds. So as long as we got it and at 4:59 we ran it down to the bank and got it deposited, we've jumped the hurdle that is in the contract. Okay? And I'm going to save it for a later discussion. What happens if the money doesn't clear? What happens if you're using electronic submission like earnest with 2 N's? There's a lot of different things to cover there, but that's the general concept. Okay. Now, painfully obvious. I see this sometimes where agents will just write in the property address, 123 Main Street. And I mean, that's good, but if you want to be the professional, I would highly recommend that you always put the tax ID in. Why?
It's what the state uses to identify the property. So when you're in disputes, you can go specifically to that tax ID and really gather almost any information you need to over the last however term that title is directed.
Thank you, Parker. If you've done this long enough, and done enough transactions, you've invariably run across the one example that I'm about to share with you. If a property in a subdivision is on a corner, and let's say it's a pretty square lot, the builder developer will allow the buyer to orient their house facing either direction, which sometimes we've seen this multiple times on county records. When the builder recorded the plat, he did it with an address facing to the south as an example. And then the person ended up building it to facing the east, which completely changes the address. So that is one reason why always include the tax ID, right? And in fact, I don't recommend this, but you could include the tax ID and exclude the property address. Again, I wouldn't recommend that, but you could, because the tax ID is the one that is attached to the property per the county and is recorded. So, all right.
Well, sometimes when you're developing lots and stuff like that, that tax ID number is the only way to identify it before an address is actually
True.
given.
True,
And so that's the other purpose for it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I sold a home several years ago that they had a dispute on boundary lines, and they literally went back and pulled the REPC and said, I bought this tax number. And they pulled the surveyor out and he pulled it up and said, this is their property.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, when we get down to brass tacks, that tax ID is super important. So don't want to spend too much time on that. Okay. The things that I highlight, for instance, included items and other included items, and then excluded items, I put it in green because we typically don't have a lot of problems with it, but when we do, they're a thing. So included items, the state, I should say UAR, and therefore this is one form that is blessed by the Division of Real Estate. There's only 6 or 7 that the DRE actually says is a DRE form. But because of past problems, past confusions, they at least give a starter list of included items. Okay. So when you look through this list, have you ever had any of these things, for instance, solar panels, be an issue? Anybody had that one? I have. Anything else? What about like ring doorbells or keypad deadbolts or any number of things? If you look through this, right, and you just do a quick search on security. Oh, there we go. Come on. I got way too many windows open apparently. But there's in the included items, the security system, right? And it's right here. Security system. There we go. Security system. Tell me, what exactly is contained in a security system? I've had people say, oh, well, that's if you pay for a monthly monitoring. I'm like, yeah, that would fall under that, but is that the only thing that falls under a security system? Is a nice keypad deadbolt lock that secures the house part of a security system?
Or motion sensors or window sensors or door sensors.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Or the panel that controls all of it. What's all included in the security system?
That's right. Yeah, you've had some experience with this, Parker. My point is, don't make sure you check your blind spots, right? And by that I mean when you see a vague term like security system, that's probably by design by UAR and the Division of Real Estate, so that a lot of things could fall within that. So don't make an assumption that it only includes this or only includes that. I've actually gone to hearings where this has been the center of dispute, right? And it was always the ones that I've been involved with. It's, yep, seller was responsible to include that item because they said they included the existing security system. Okay.
By the way, Matt, it should be mentioned too in those security systems. It's also smoke detectors. It's also CO detectors. It's also water detectors, and they're little tiny things that you don't typically see. So you have to ask your client very specifically what's included in this security system.
Yeah. Okay. Now it begs the question then, what is the purpose of the second section that says other included items? Well, clearly they kind of give us a teaser on this. Well, we didn't have washers, dryers, refrigerators, and microwaves up above. So those are things that can be, and many are not attached to the property. Now, most of the time, microwaves these days are above the range, they're bolted in, and therefore it's attached. But there's still sometimes people that have nice microwaves that are countertop. And so if you wanted to include those items, or anybody ever moved a fridge in their life? I just finished moving one. Guess what they're on? They're on wheels, which probably means they're not attached to the property, which means they're not real property, they're private property. And so we have this other section that allows us to either include those 4 checkbox items or check the box other. And I highlighted this one right here because this is what is known as a contractual conditional, right? All of these things can be checked. What if you were, as an example, Kyle, I'm going to ask you this. What if you were renting your refrigerator? You went down to one of these, Aaron's or other rental places, and you had rented that and you got an offer on your house and they checked the box you're to include the refrigerator. Do you have to provide it?
No.
Right. You're correct, because the condition in section 1.2 is, yes, it's in place, but is it presently owned? No, because we're renting it. Now, to avoid problems, we should declare that up front. Don't just rely on the contract, but if push comes to shove, these are the conditions that matter in contract language. I would just say this: in contracts especially, words have meaning and words matter. Okay, Chase, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, just a dumb question, but like fridges have the water lines that are connected to the house. That would not count, right?
No.
Okay,
No.
I just want to make sure that wasn't some
Yeah,
stipulation or something.
I'm sure somewhere somebody has tried to make that argument, but yeah,
I'm sure.
And you know, the fact that it's declared in section 1.2 as something that you would definitively have to check in the affirmative probably is another indicator that, yeah, no, that was never intended. Okay.
People are really attached to their appliances, as we've probably all experienced in our business at one point or another. So this specific clause, presently owned and in place, essentially says, hey, you can't swap this out for something out after we've gone under contract. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you bring up another good question. See, this is why it's great to have a group chiming in from all of our collective experiences, because we've had this, Parker. We've had where somebody says, hey, we want you to include refrigerator. And the particular house, let's say, has a fridge in the upstairs kitchen. They have a kitchen or kitchenette in the basement, and they happen to have a fridge freezer in the garage for extra storage. And so it says refrigerators, right? If they check the box for refrigerators, what's the implication? What's the contractual consequence of that? I'm going to get back to your specific question, but Parker, but you have to include all three?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you're signing off on plural refrigerators. Now, if you were a good buyer's agent, you would specifically call them out. And this is to your point, Parker. I've advised agents a long time ago. If you're going to include a refrigerator, if you're going to include a washer or dryer, you know, the implication from that statement up above is presently owned and in place. Well, we might have photos from the MLS. I've just always found it a good practice to say, we'll include the front load washer and dryers currently on the property with model numbers such and such. Pretty hard for anybody to dodge that after that, right? They can't come in and put some cheap top loaders in and say, yep, I included a washer and dryer. First, they weren't the ones that were in place, but if you took an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you just said Whirlpool front loaders on pedestals, model numbers such and such, pretty hard for somebody to claim anything other than, yep, those are the ones we're leaving. Okay, same things with the fridge. Yeah, it's a GE model XYZ, right?
Hey,
Take
Matt, do you, oh,
extra
sorry, go
time.
ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
I say, do you recommend, not recommend, because I usually stick on addendums that state per section 1.1 and 1.2, seller does not warranty or guarantee any of those items. Because I've had people come back and try to say because
Yeah,
something
you
didn't
know,
work after a month.
it's a good point, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But if you go down to, I'm going to bounce around, sorry guys. If you go down to section 8, right? Actually, I should say 10.2.
I was going to say it's 10.2 because I've
10.2, I
gone through
already have
this.
it highlighted. The buyer is acknowledging that they're getting things in an as-is condition without what? Any expressed or implied warranties of any kind. So could you write it in an addendum? Yes. Could you also just say, you know, the items included in section 1.2 are governed by, you know, section 10.2? Yeah.
Perfect.
But do you
I've
need
argued with people about it,
need
so thank
to?
you.
Yeah, do you need to? No, but you know what? Sometimes we gotta, and I say this lovingly, sometimes we gotta dumb it down.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So, you know, and here's the last part. This little section, excluded items. Listen, if you're the listing agent, this is where I have the most problems, you guys. And guess what? A lot of it centers on. I've had this so many times I can't even count anymore. Things like a jacuzzi, right? And they're like, yeah, that's not part of the house. It's out on a patio. And the other side, the buyer side says, yeah, well, it's attached by a 220 cable that an electrician has to come in and hardwire. So therefore it's attached. And you know what? This is so easy to navigate if you're the seller or the seller's agent and you talk to them, as you should, before they sign an offer, just say, hey, maybe we should counter back and say 1.3 excludes the hot tub or the jacuzzi. Wow, problem resolved. And rather than waiting until you get to final walkthrough and they say, hey, where's the jacuzzi that was on the patio? And now you're up against a crisis and people are all butthurt and everybody's, you know, threatening this, that, and the other, and you're like, oh my gosh, how did this get to this place? Well, it may be on you. I'm just saying, right?
Matt, just curious.
Let me
is-
finish one thought, Parker. I want you to
Okay.
comment, but my feeling is this: after watching agents for 2 decades, is we get listing or representing buyer fatigue, and what happens is they get all excited. It's like the movie Tommy Boy. Oh, it's my deal. I'm JoJo the circus boy or whatever. It's funny, but it's kind of true. We're just like, oh my gosh, finally. And we kind of sometimes, because of that fatigue, we throw caution to the side and we don't look at this critically and be like, hey, am I really making sure I'm doing the best job in preventing potential problems down the road? There's not a lot of things you have to pay attention to, but there's a few. And if you just force yourself to pay attention, you'll save yourself a lot of grief. Parker, go ahead.
I was just wondering if butthurt was an official term of Remax Associates or.
No, that's
read my mind, Parker.
you all know what I'm saying. Sorry. That's the South County in me coming out.
Matt, I think that's a validation that you did the right thing by asking him to let you finish, because if that was what he was breaking in for,
Fair
I'll let
point.
him wait.
Fair point. Okay. All right. Moving on. Let's see. Where are we time-wise? I want to make sure I get through this section. All right. I've got 20 minutes. Water service. This is becoming a bigger deal. If you listen to things in real estate, industry communications, they refer to water as the new liquid gold, right? Especially if you're selling properties that have irrigation rights, well rights, water shares, water rights. Don't ignore this. These things are getting very expensive. And when you just assume certain things are going to be included, you know what? When you break assume down, right? Ass, you, me. It's really a very descriptive word. So what does it actually say in here? The property at its default will include all water rights and water shares. Oh, but wait, there's a contractual contingency. If this little word is so powerful, if any, that are the legal source for the seller's current culinary and irrigation water services. So much like we said up above, if owned and in place. So I had one just a while ago. Well, it's probably been 6 months ago up in Salt Lake. Sellers had water rights. The city, the local municipality eventually came and said, guess what? We're going to do everything now through the municipality. You need to use our water. Well, that means that the owner still had water rights. Okay. But they weren't being used anymore. The city was providing the culinary water that they needed. And so the buyer, who was represented outside, thought they were entitled to the water shares. And I had the uncomfortable but simple opportunity to explain to them section 1.4. And I said, the sellers currently are not using that for irrigation. Yes, they have the shares. They're not using it for culinary or irrigation. So by definition of the offer that you, the buyer, put forward, and let me stop for a second here. This is important for you guys to know when you're dealing with buyers, and you got to find a way to say this nicely, politely, without offending, but it's super important. When they use the Division of Real Estate's REPC, this becomes the buyer's contract. This becomes their words that they're putting forward, right? So it's not like we sneak something in section 1.4. If they didn't do the job and didn't read their own language, their own words, well, that's kind of on them. And so there's polite ways to say that. And if I'm dealing with if I'm dealing with Stockton and Stockton thinks water shares, be like, Stockton, listen, I love working with you and I'm trying to keep this deal on track, right? Retool the focus, that we're collaborative, that I'm not looking to offend anybody. Unfortunately, I need to walk through this with you, Stockton, so that we're on the same page, right? That's a lot better than being like, dude, you don't know your contract. Right? You gotta think this through and try and keep people collaborative with you, but still be direct. And then I would read this through him. I'm like, so unfortunately, Stockton, yes, my people do have water shares that are attached to the property, but they haven't used them for culinary or irrigation water for over a year. So therefore, the contract terms that your buyer put forward are very explicit. They're not included in the sale. So that's good, right? What would be better is this last one for me as a listing agent to counter back and say 1.4 to exclude from this sale water shares X, Y, and Z. Right? Because right at the get-go, nobody has any reasonable expectation that those are going to be included when they settle, right? Because there's very specific language. So good, better, best, right?
Hey, Matt, on this subject, since I can say I'm semi an expert on this because the last 5 years, Salt Lake County has been adjudicating all the water rights through the Big Sandy, water district that they had.
Yep.
And so through that process, one thing that people need to be aware of, especially if it's maybe like an older person selling a home or a family selling their parents' home after they passed away, is that when you're talking about those actual water rights and you're talking about wells, those could have been taken away from them if they didn't respond during this period. So
That's
as
right.
far as the water shares go, I have 5 water shares. And so those are actual shares that they can't take away. But they did collapse a lot of wells that were on properties that nobody responded on that no longer have the rights. So that is something you really, really should look into if your client thinks they're getting either the water rights or an irrigation slash, a well. If it's not water shares, you really should research it.
For sure. Good reminder. I appreciate that, Clint. And I would say that's actually reinforces this. If you're representing the seller, make sure you exclude them here. If you're the buyer and you think you're going to get them, then make sure, right, that when you get seller's disclosures, and we'll come to this, seller's disclosures say that you're by the seller's disclosures deadline, you're to provide proof of the water rights and the water shares. Dee, you had a question?
I do. As the listing agent or the buyer, whose job is it to confirm water shares?
Yep. All right. If I could redirect you down to section 7, here we go. All right. I got these highlighted, right? So in seller's disclosures, I love this. Please retrain your brain if when you hear seller's disclosures, you think of a 15-page document, because it's not. It's that and so much more. That's only item A, right? Lead-based paint disclosure, commitment for title insurance, CCNRs, recent minutes and budgets and financial statements if there's an HOA. Item I, D, this answers your question. Evidence, so this is the seller's obligation to proactively, definitively provide to the buyers evidence of any water rights and or shares referenced in section 1.4. So if there's anything that's currently so if nothing else was checked in section 1.4, the default is if you're currently using it for culinary or irrigation water, it's part of the deal. And you have a material obligation in section 7I to provide them written proof. And if you don't, you're in default, you're in breach of the contract, and they can go after remedies if they choose. Okay.
Did have that on a multi-million-dollar home. They didn't list it on the MLS that there was water shares and didn't put it in seller's property condition disclosures.
Yeah, and yet section 1.4 still governs.
Okay, thank
Right?
you.
All right. We do a whole class on water rights and shares, and so that's just a teaser for something in the future. So I'm going to have to crank up the pace here. Purchase price. Listen, we all know this. The first box should match the last box, right? If your numbers don't match up there, you got a problem in your contract. Now, earnest money, the new loan. balance in price, in purchase price, cash at settlement. I see a lot of people choosing not to fill these in or put TBD. Somebody could make the case that you haven't you don't have a complete contract, right? Because of all the words that are in here. Now it's interesting because right here it says section 2.1C through E, right? Sorry, not through E. C and E can change or may be adjusted as deemed necessary, not solely by the buyer, but the buyer and the lender. And
Matt?
so, yeah.
So my thought on this one is that I always put the most that I think my buyer is actually legitimately considering. Is that okay? I want the seller to see that we look as pretty as possible, knowing that we could change it by 5K or we could change our loan program even. I know we have options, but is it okay to put like the way I ask my buyer is, should we put the biggest amount that you possibly think you might actually be considering? Is that an okay way to look at it?
Yeah. So I love that point, Esther. It's great because, sellers are interesting and sellers agents are equally interesting. And my point to buyers and buyers agents is try and remove as many roadblocks as possible, even if they don't seem logical to you, if they have the potential of being a roadblock in your offer. So to your point, if you put in the maximum amount, right, I can bring in 50% cash, so 250,000 on a $500,000 home, and I put that there. How does that read for a seller? Oh, I've got a really solid buyer here, right? Versus TBD. You see the psychology there? If you put TBD as a seller and a seller's agent, I'm like, I don't know if these guys are a good bet because they're not willing to declare in their contract, right? And so, yes, Esther, great point. My point is, please make sure you pay attention to those two boxes. Fill out the ones that are appropriate. Do not leave them blank, and realize 2.1C and 2.E can change. 2.1E can change. Okay. I really should have highlighted this whole section, but I cover that when we have the appropriate addendums. But remember, this is important. If any portion of what's above in section 2.1 is going to be required to require the sale of a buyer's property, then you must use the property addendum, subject to the sale of buyer's property addendum. Okay, this is significant. We've run into significant problems by this being ignored when in reality there was a property in place, and yes, that can be a default in the contract. It could also be considered fraudulent. So don't go there. Make sure you fill out section 2.2 correctly.
I have a question.
Yes. You're muted, Deborah.
So sorry, I had to turn it on mute because my kids started yelling. But so say someone says we're going to put $60,000 down as a down payment, and let's say they have 20,000 in cash, and they can cover closing costs no matter what. They can cover their loan. They were just going to put additional money down. But let's say the other 40,000 they were planning on selling their house, but they didn't have to. Do you need to disclose that? Is that subject to sale or no?
So I want to make sure, I think I've got the question. If somebody put that they're going to have 60,000 in line item E, and they really only had 20,000, as their agent, I would strongly advise them not to do that. Would it be the end of the world? Probably not. If you show up at closing and the seller gets all the money they want, or agreed to, nobody's going to throw a fit. But I just think it's important to, as much as possible, correctly reflect the lay of the land so we never get in the crosshairs of somebody who gets litigious. I was wronged because you and your client, you participated in a fraud with me. And I know this is extraneous. I'm not saying just item E, but anything that has to do with the finances, right? If you knew that they had to have a home to sell and then you intentionally sent it over with section 2.2 saying is not, you're going to get lumped into the liability game. And I would suggest you don't go there. I say this to a lot of agents because sometimes we as agents were a little cavalier. Nobody's going to do anything. My favorite saying to my office managers who are on the call, Susan, is it's not a problem until it's a problem. And when it does become a problem, it tends to be significant and you don't sleep well at night and it consumes a lot of time and it can have some real consequences. So just don't go there. Okay. All right. Rapid firing to finish this out. Possession is another one that we as an industry have not been doing a great job on. We assume people read their contracts. We assume they understand what possession is. I mean, this is in sequence, in order. It's in time sequence. Settlement, closing, and then possession, right? In that order. You go in and sign the documents. Certain things have to transpire, including the lender approving the final package and, you know, everything else being recorded. Closing is when all of that has been done, and it enumerates it for you, right? Settlement's completed, proceeds have been delivered, the documents have been recorded at the county. Then we go to further restrictions based on possession, right? You could probably do away with at least 10 to 15% of my problems as a principal broker with this one alone. Be clear to your buyer what these three things mean. Just because you signed on Friday doesn't mean you're moving in on Friday. Don't line up your moving truck to show up on Saturday. Don't tell me the woes, you know, everybody's sleeping in the car or at a hotel and we need to move in. And can't we just negotiate with the sellers to allow us to put things into the closet, into the garage? Oh my gosh. Seriously. I'm prematurely aging. Please help me. This is such a key one to communicate these three things: settlement, closing, and possession. Make sure everybody's clear on that one, what that one means. And you know what? I just beat up on the buyers. Make sure your seller knows too. When you sign saying you're going to deliver possession, that means all of your stuff needs to be out, free of all personal belongings and broom clean. I get that one as well. And then, you know, the fun with that one is, well, I'm going to call the police and you're trespassing and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh my gosh, if everybody would just spend 5 minutes explaining and being clear of what this means and setting the proper expectations, they would save hours and hours and hours of problems. So please do that. All right. Section 4, this is a big one. We're going to finish on this. Prorations, assessments, and other obligations. We now are all very familiar with Section 4. Why? Because it has real estate brokerage compensation in Section 4.3E. But let's quickly talk about this. We all know about prorations. If you don't know, go talk to your title person. Special assessments. Special assessments. The reason I have this highlighted is, do builders typically use the state-approved REPC? Short answer is no, they do not. So it begs the question, if the DRE felt it was important to cover these things, maybe you should find that same section or equivalent section in the builder's contract. And if they don't have one, maybe provide some addendum language to make sure this stuff is clear. Special improvement districts, PIDs, HOA transfer fees, and sending over a copy of the builder's contract to title is not adequate. It's not adequate. They don't, first of all, they're not licensed in real estate. So I'm not saying they can't read a REPC, but they typically don't have time to do that. And we can't go back to them and say, gosh, how come you didn't read the builder's 32-page purchase contract with 4 others that you received today? It's just not going to happen. So if we have that expectation, that's probably on us. All right. We all know about escrow fees, rental deposits, and prepaid rents. I get this one from time to time. If you have an ADU and you've got a tenant in the basement and you're selling it, make sure your seller knows that any rental deposits, which they probably use to go on a trip to Cancun, needs to be included in the purchase, right? Okay. Let's utilities. This is an interesting one. You may not know this. Utility services. Buyer agrees to be responsible for all utilities and other services provided to the property when? After the settlement deadline. So if you have 4 days until closing and another 6 days for possession, the buyer's responsible. The default language in the contract is responsible for utilities the day after settlement, or 6 o'clock, or sorry, 5:01. Right? If we go with the default timing. Not a big
If
deal.
the sellers are mining Bitcoin, disclose that.
Say that again.
If the sellers are mining Bitcoin and they rack up a bill of $1,500 in electricity, the buyers are on the hook for that.
Yeah, or whatever else. If they have a grow in the basement or something else, yeah, that's going to be on the buyer. So make sure the buyer knows. All right, we're going to finish on this one, the real estate brokerage compensation. If you have not been paying attention, the state in November, UAR, came out with new forms in regards to the ERS and how it dovetails with this. Quick trivia question for everybody on the call. Which way is the best way to get your compensation? Through the REPC or through a broker compensation agreement?
Broker compensation agreement.
Anybody want to disagree with Parker? Come on, let's have some fun. Somebody disagree. Jessica, just disagree with him.
I'll say Rep C.
Okay, there we go. Somebody says the REPC. And you know what? I hate answers like this, but it's really true. It depends. It depends. I will give you the quick and dirty on this. The REPC is probably the easiest, but it has some consequences, right? Right. And what it does, the part I want you to remember about section 4.3E is if you write it in here, right, and you're the listing agent, it's effectively bypassing or overriding your ERS section 2.2. Because I've had this question so many times since the national settlement. Well, my ERS, just to quickly reset this for everybody, in the ERS section 2 brokerage fee, it says 2.1. How much is the listing brokerage going to get? Section 2.2, how much does the seller authorize me to offer out by way of compensation and to sign off on in a broker to broker compensation agreement? And let's say it's 2% in section 2.2. We'll stick with twos. 2.2 is 2. And then the seller signs a REPC that says the seller's going to pay 3%. Which one governs?
The Rep C,
Why, Deborah?
because it's the most recently agreed upon agreement.
True, true, true. And the point I wanted to make with that, and what you said is correct, but in 2.2 of the ERS, the only way that amount gets obligated is through a broker to broker compensation agreement. In this case, one doesn't exist. And so it's not even a parameter. It's not a lid of 2%. If the seller signs off saying, I, the seller, what does it say? Am willing to pay the buyer's brokerage 3%, then they're essentially bypassing the ERS. I'm still going to get, as the listing agent, I'm still going to get what's in 2.1, right? And the seller at closing has obligated themselves to pay the buyer's brokerage directly via this contract 3%. So they don't bump into each other is what I'm trying to say. Okay, now.
Well, they're
Bigger
contracts between
problem
different
though, right?
parties.
Oh boy, that got a few people chiming in. What was that, James?
So they're contracts between different parties.
It's two different contracts between two different parties. That is correct. Now, here's an
So it's
interesting.
not going to be 5%, is it?
Well, that's where I was going, Deborah. Let's muddy the waters a little further. So we're clear, if there is no broker to broker compensation and there is a REPC with compensation, what's signed to in the REPC is obligated from the seller to the buyer, and no offense, kind of has nothing to do with us. Okay, now what happens in that same situation? What if the buyer's agent came to me as the listing agent and said, hey, Matt, is your seller willing to pay broker to compensation? Said, yeah. How much? Can I tell him? Yes, I can. I'm authorized per section 2.2. So I say, for the right offer, which typically means a full price offer, because that's what they agreed to in their listing, market the property for this, and I will pay you that. Yeah, 2%. And then D's the buyer's agent, and she turns around and has her buyer put 3% in section E. How much is the seller obligated to pay? It's a trick question.
Whatever they agree to.
Well, So they agreed in the REPC to 3%. They agreed in the broker to broker compensation to have that added to section 2.1. Here's the kicker, and this is what you want to pay attention to. Have we seen a lot of it? No. Will we see it? I'm pretty sure we will. I'm going to use a quick backstory. Kyle, who is the builder down there in St. George that offers 4% all the time on their listing? What's the name of that builder?
S&S.
S&S. So they came and presented our sales meeting a couple months ago, and they're great. I mean, yeah, I won't go into a lot of details, but they pay 4%. So if you have a buyer broker, Kyle, and your buyer broker says 3%, even if the builder wants to pay you 4%, can you be paid that 4%?
Nope.
Oh, so Deborah, this is coming back to that situation. If the buyer has a buyer broker for 3%, and that you have a REPC with 3% and a broker to broker compensation for 2%, they can only be paid 3%. But if that same buyer's agent was smart and said, well, you know, I've got S&S builders as an example that these people may be interested in, so I sign them to a buyer broker agreement with 4%, and we come back to this, how much does the buyer broker get paid?
4%.
4%. The hard cap is whatever is in your buyer broker agreement, and it will take into account anything that is in the REPC and in the broker to broker compensation agreement. So just be aware of that, especially especially if you're a listing agent, right? Probably the good measure on this is if there was ever any question. So for instance, if a broker to broker compensation agreement had been signed and then you get a REPC with compensation, since the state has now agreed to compensation in the REPC, it is fair game for us to say seller's total obligation to buyer's brokerage via this and any other means is capped at 3%. Would that work? Yeah, it would. So I share things like this with agents from time to time, and they're like, well, that's more work these days. And I'm like, yep, that's kind of what got forced upon us, but it is totally, you're totally able to navigate it. All right, so we finished off with section 4. The rest of it will go faster, but like I said, if you're interested in my copies with March, please send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a spectacular week. And those of you in St. George, I will see you this week for sales meeting. Okay?
Thanks, Matt.
Y'all.
See ya.